Welcome, my friends, to the Heritage of the Americas Museum. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Once again, right? We had a great talk last week. So I am Joey Martinez, as you guys know, also known as the Pre-Columbian Gentleman, owner-operator of the Pre-Columbian Gentleman online art gallery that specializes in pre-Columbian art. I also do educational and historical videos talking about the art, talking about the the places, the sites down south, and just history in general, Mesoamerican history, right, before Columbus arrived. And I post on my social media accounts on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And that's where this video will be going to. So for those that are watching at home, this will be on TikTok and YouTube within a few days. So as a person of Hispanic descent, I'm 100% Mexican on both sides. These stories and this information, it holds a special place in my heart, and it's really cool to get it out. And I think that there are a lot of people, and you don't have to be obviously Hispanic to appreciate the cultures, because it's not just Hispanic history, but it's actually human history, and I think that's what makes it really, really cool. And especially with all the discoveries that we're coming across right now, down in El Mirador, down in the Amazon. I mean, it's just kind of changing our narrative of what we thought, ancient life was like in the Americas, right? So at this point, I'd like to officially welcome you to the first annual Hispanic Heritage Month celebration. This is the second week of it. We have a lot of cool things going on. The snakes are out there, so we can see the snakes. So we began our conversation last week talking about pre-Columbian art and how it exploded onto the art market, right? So if you missed it, it is available on YouTube and TikTok, so cheap plug for those that are watching. So today is going to be part two, where we'll be discussing the laws and legalities around pre-Columbian art. We're going to explore some of the misconceptions and mistruths, and also ask the questions that people are afraid to ask. And you can say, well, why are they afraid to ask it? Well, maybe because they don't want to know the answers. And so it's a complex field to navigate. And then hopefully this talk will help clarify things. And as I was putting this talk together, a lot of it is based on just personal information that I've just come across in the last 20 years, but also just doing the research and everything. And that this is going to be a really cool place for a lot of people to, it's like a tool basically for either people that are new to pre-Columbian art, or even just existing people that are collectors, dealers, people that have galleries, and even politicians, because there's a lot of stuff currently going on in the marketplace. And it's a one-stop place where you can find all this information, because honestly, it doesn't really exist in one spot. You have to just research and check different sources to get all this information. So I'm not bragging, but I think it's kind of a cool talk. So there's going to be some great information coming out to you guys. Okay, so to start, I'm going to talk about the laws that mention pre-Columbian art. And this is actually super easy, because there are no laws. There are no laws that specifically say anything about pre-Columbian art. Okay, so that's really interesting, right? And but what I thought was interesting is that if there's no laws that mention pre-Columbian art, well then what is there? Okay, so we actually have agreements, and then we have there are laws, but they're not specifically mentioning pre-Columbian art, but they're part of the laws. Okay. Now, the first or the largest agreement that we're going to talk about is the UNESCO Treaty, right? That's the big one right there. So, what is the UNESCO Treaty? Well, first of all, what is UNESCO? Does anybody know what UNESCO is? Right. I'm sure you guys have heard of the UNESCO heritage sites and all that, right? Okay, well, UNESCO, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't know this until I actually did the research for this, but you know UNESCO, right? So it's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization. That's a mouthful, right? It was founded on November 16th, 1945, and the goal was to control peace and security, which is kind of crazy, right? How it kind of changed over the years, right? And so the first major document was formed in 1954, and it was the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of an armed conflict. So basically, this is right after World War II, and they're trying to protect the sites, because a lot of stuff was damaged during World War II, right? And so just, even the Sphinx, right, was hit by a tank shells. Okay, so that was really interesting, right? And then the next big one came in 1972, and that's the UNESCO treaty that we know, and it's the Convention of Protecting World Heritage, across the world. And so basically it was to safeguard cultural heritage of outstanding universal value. And so that's the one that we use today. It's kind of like the guideline. It sets up everything that we use for pre-Columbian art and the laws that came afterwards. Okay, so now who joined UNESCO? Well, Mexico joined in 1972, Peru joined in 1972, and then Guatemala in 1985. Those were the three big players, right? You have to remember the UNESCO Treaty, it was actually formed in 1970, but was ratified later on. That's why you get the gap there. So it wasn't quite ratified yet. And so what did the UNESCO treaty do, right? What's it about? Well, it stopped the export of cultural patrimony, which is basically artifacts. Pre-Columbian art is part of that, right? Antiquities. It put protections in place. For example, before the UNESCO treaty, there weren't protections in place in a lot of different countries, and so this put the absolute protection. And then legally, it established ownership rights to that cultural patrimony. So it said specifically that this is ours, it belongs to the state or the government of the different countries. And so it laid claim to that. Because prior to that, there were laws, but they're pretty vague and pretty much not enforceable. Okay, so that's the UNESCO treaty that we know today, and that's pretty much what we use. Okay. The next big thing that came with UNESCO was 1978, and that's the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and that's kind of cool, right? We all know. Basically, World Heritage Sites are sites that are deemed important to just humanity, and all of mankind, quote unquote, womankind, all of us. And so in 1978, the first 12 were actually dedicated. And it was interesting because I'm like, why did they dedicate 12? It's because they didn't want to just do one and make it seem like it was important. They kind of spread it out. So for example, the Galapagos Islands was part of it. The city center at Quito in Peru was part of it. And then Yellowstone and Mesa Verde parks, they were part of it as well too. So that was kind of cool, right? The UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And obviously it's expanded, there's so many now in the world, right? Tikal is a part of it, Chichen Itza, down in Mexico. So it was really interesting, okay? Now, the United States was a founding member in 1946 when UNESCO was first formed, the whole convention in its entirety. However, it withdrew in 1984, then rejoined once again in 2003, and then withdrew again in July of this year, actually 2025, and it's supposed to go into effect at the end of 2026. So we will no longer be a member of UNESCO. And the reason being is that this is not just this time in 2025, but also before that, they quoted mismanagement, corruption, and policies that are at odds with U.S. interests and values. So again, I thought that was really interesting. And then the other thing that is really interesting too is that over the years, the UNESCO Treaty of 1972, the one that established the cultural patrimony rights, it has expanded and put different language that was a little bit more clarifying. And so 1984 and then again in 2003, they added language to the UNESCO Treaty of 72. So I know it's a lot to talk about, but it's setting the stage basically for what we're going to talk about. But yeah, so 1984 and 2003, they clarified it and came up with a little bit more specific language, and so it strengthened it. Now, some scholars now believe that or legal scholars believe that 84 and 2003 is actually the real dates, not 1972 for the cultural patrimony because of these changes. But it just shows you that there's a really complex situation going on because the laws, the way they're formed, some of them are pretty vague, and then the complexity of the whole situation really when you think about it. Okay. So now the next big thing that really happened, and this is actually another big one, it's called the Convention of Cultural Property Implementation, or it's known as CPIA for short. And this is actually a law. It was codified into law. It's U.S. Statute Code 19, Chapter 14, 2600. You hear that a lot when you talk about artifacts and especially pre-Columbian art. And so basically what it was is that the United States could not adopt the 1972 Convention of UNESCO because it's not United States law, right? It's an international agreement. But to make that stick in the United States, they actually codified it into law, and that's what you see. And this was in 1983. So basically, in 1983, that's when they said, okay, we're going to recognize the UNESCO treaty, not in its entirety, but pretty close to that. And so, what does that article do? Well, Article 7b, it prohibits the import of cultural objects that have been documented as stolen from museums, religious, or public institutions. So, okay, that makes sense, right? And then Article 9 provides a mechanism for the U.S. to enter into bilateral agreements at any time with these countries so they can make changes and actually say, hey, no, this is legal, this is not legal. But they really haven't done anything, okay? Now, the two big interesting points are that basically it narrows the full convention. It doesn't say, hey, we're going to recognize the entire UNESCO treaty as law. And the biggest thing is that it doesn't describe what actually constitutes cultural property. Remember I said a lot of it's pretty complex and vague? Well, that's pretty vague, right? And then also, any object that isn't fully documented isn't covered. So with the UNESCO treaty, it has to be documented in that country. So for example, say a piece that came out in 1969, 1970, before the UNESCO treaty, went to the United States, Mexico wanted the piece back. I'm going to use Mexico for a lot of examples because it's just easier. They wanted that piece back. Well, they need to prove that it was in the country before that. So it has to be written documentation, pictures, written accounts, something like that. And so it's a high standard, right? But again, you're talking about property rights, and so that's where they're at. So But anyway, so yeah, the CPIA or the U.S. statute that I just mentioned, it's a law, but it doesn't specifically say pre-Columbian. Like it doesn't say you can't collect pre-Columbian. It doesn't say you can. It's just a law that codifies parts of the UNESCO treaty. So those are the two big ones that we really work with. And again, remember how I mentioned before about the UNESCO treaty wording, being strengthened. Some scholars, legal scholars, believe that this 1983 is actually the date. So anything imported prior to 83 would be legal to own after would be, because this is actually the codified law. So however, as I'll talk about in a little bit, the United States recognizes 1972 as the date for Mexico, and again, whatever dates that the UNESCO treaty was ratified for the different countries, again, it's their claim to the cultural patrimony, okay? So now in regards to that, there is one landmark ruling that will kind of complete the legalities, right? Because remember I said it's a really complex situation. And I'm only going to mention it because I thought it was really interesting, okay? So in 1979, the United States versus McLean, so what was going on is this family, last name was McLean, they were illegally falsifying documents to export pieces into the United States and saying that they were imported to the U.S. prior to 1972. So they were falsifying because in reality, they came out in the 80s. And so they're going back, they're backdating these documents to prove that, hey, this is legal to own and whatnot. But the FBI found out about it, Mexico found out. And so anyway, this case was launched. The big thing that came out of this was Mexico was using an 1897 law that asserted claim to the ownership. This is a law going way back. Sometimes the United States does these funky things too, right? Where it's like they use these really antiquated laws that are still in the books. Well, this is what they did too. And this 1897 law said that Mexico owns their cultural patrimony. However, the courts found that it was too vague and not enforceable. So basically, it all goes back to that 1972 UNESCO treaty date, and that's kind of where we're at today. And so I do want to mention that on a few years ago, I was really lucky to be, this is actually during COVID time, I was home, as I'm sure we all were, right? And there was a Zoom announced on, a friend of mine mentioned that it was actually going to be talking about the trafficking of cultural artifacts. I'm like, hey, this is really cool. So I signed up for it, and there's only a few people on it, which is really kind of crazy when you think about it, right? The amount of people that collect and, dealers and that kind of thing. And so the person that was actually doing the Zoom was the Director of Antiquities Trafficking at the Department of Justice. And I was like, hey, this is kind of cool that I'm a small fry in the big scheme of things. And so yeah, I got to do a personal conversation with this person. And basically what he was saying, well, not basically, but what he was saying was that the United States recognizes the UNESCO treaty as the date. So they want, as far as like if you import the pieces prior to 1972, they're legal to own. After that, that's where the problem comes in, and then obviously there could be some legal ramifications to it. So yeah, but that was really interesting, and again, it was confirmed because a lot of people they don't believe the UNESCO treaty is those are the true dates or whatnot, but that's what the Department of Justice and the Director of Antiquities Trafficking says, that those are the dates that we recognize. So I thought that was really cool. Okay, now so those are the laws, and that's the framework and everything. Okay, and so what I do want to talk about, that there's some things going on that are confusing things even more. And one of the big things that has happened recently, in fact, it was 2018. The First Lady of Mexico, married to Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, right? He's no longer in office anymore, but his wife, the First Lady, she started a campaign called Mi Patrimonio No Se Vende. And that means in English is my patrimony isn't for sale. And so what the goal of this was to repatriate every piece that's left Mexico and to get it all back. And basically saying that it was all stolen, plundered, and Mexico has the absolute legal right to these pieces, right? It sounds kind of wild and crazy, right? I mean, they want everything back from museums, personal collections, dealers, you name it. Okay, and so what's interesting about this is that I understand where they're coming from, right? But it's a kind of a series of mistruths, right? Because how can you want to get everything back that's left the country? Remember, these were all sold legally to the art, with the exception, I'm sure a few exceptions, right? They were sold legally to the art market before the protections were in place, right? But the part that they leave out, and they don't mention this, and you'll never hear this mentioned anywhere else, so I'm glad this is going to be on the internet, was that in Mexico, in current law right now, they honor property rights. And so what you find on your property, whether it's in the land, whether it's on the land or in the air rights, it's yours. You own that piece, right? And so what Mexico does is, as long as you register it with INA, which is the archaeological body of the government, you can keep that piece. Now, technically, the state owns it, but but for all intents and purposes, the people that find it own the pieces. So whatever you find on your land, you have to remember the majority of pieces that are pre-Columbian are found on private land. This is a great example. Has anybody ever been to Teotihuacan down in central Mexico? Okay, well, the city center is actually 8 square miles. That's the city center, right? And it expands even beyond that. The actual ruins are only about maybe a mile, 2 miles. So that means you have about 6 square miles of dwellings, houses that are on the ancient site itself. And so people find, like we were there last year, you're literally stepping on artifacts when you're anywhere outside of that, because there's so many, like just shards of clay, of ceramics, and obsidian blades, and there's so much stuff there, right? But the point being is that what people are finding is yours to keep, right? And so how can you, again, this is where the questions come into play, right? Well, how can you ask for patrimony to be returned when you don't mention that, well, in Mexico it's legal to collect, you can actually own these pieces, right? And so if you're saying that the government or the state owns these pieces, well, then how can individuals in Mexico own it too, right? It's just kind of, I don't know, to me it's a little, not, I would say the word dishonest, but maybe not, saying 100%, maybe a mistruth, not being 100% transparent, right? I think that's the proper word for that. Okay, so now there are some hard questions that people really haven't asked before, right? So when I talk about artifacts, I talk about the pieces, the importance, where they're from, really educational stuff. And sometimes right here on not just my videos, but just in general, people are like, well, send that back to Mexico, right? And again, I'm using Mexico, it could be Guatemala, it could be Costa Rica, anything pre-Columbian, right? Well, send that back to Mexico, okay? Well, what I like to say is like, why? It's funny, it's such a basic question, right? And it's really interesting because it seems like people are kind of afraid of discourse and having these conversations, right? And so it's like, well, why? Well, it belongs to the people of Mexico, okay? Well, I'm Mexican, 100%, right? So am I not entitled to it? And again, obviously I'm one of the few Mexican, collectors and dealers out there, but I'm just saying that, just for all intents and purposes, it's part of the argument, right? Or, part of the conversation. So, or how about this? It belongs in Mexico. That piece belongs in Mexico. Well, we're in San Diego, and when this piece was made, San Diego was technically, quote unquote, part of Mexico. Well, Mexico didn't exist until, the 1800s, right? But anyway, but you know what I'm saying though? So it's like these conversations aren't happening. And I think they're really important when you're talking about something like this, because it is complicated, okay? Now, to further complicate things, right? Okay, so let's just say okay, that's fine. We're gonna send everything back to Mexico. Well, who gets it? Who's going to get these pieces? Like, who's entitled to it, right? Is the government entitled to it? Remember, these governments didn't exist when these pieces were made, right? Well, maybe it should go to the people that made it. Well, how do you figure out who actually, like, the person that made this has been long gone. We're talking thousands of years in some cases, right? So, their families, well, how do you determine that? How do you go back? And so those questions really aren't asked, right? So if you're talking about returning, private property to back to Mexico, where do you send it back? Like, who do you send it to? Like how, the point is, like, once the cat's out of the bag, remember, these pieces were sold legally into the art market when it was legal to do so, before these countries laid claim to them legally, and that's why the UNESCO Treaty was so important, because that was a document that officially laid claim to these pieces. So I think that's what's important. Okay, well, another thing they say, well, how about you send it back to a museum? Again, you have to ask, okay, which museum? Who's going to get it, right? And then there's no framework for how you implement this, right? Like, okay, well, how do we know that? We have to remember that there is corruption in Mexico, right? How do we know these pieces are going to go into a museum? And I'll talk a little bit more about the whole museum thing in a little bit too. But it's just, again, these conversations aren't happening. I think it's really interesting, right? And the fact is that nobody talks about this. It's just, people are screaming at each other, send that back. Well, and no, I'm not going to, and it's just like, well, let's have a frank discussion. And then at the very end of this conversation, I'm going to talk about, like, hey, things are actually pretty good right now. I think there's a lot of balance going on in the whole market. Okay. Another thing I want to talk about that people don't realize is that, okay, for example, in Mexico, very few museums actually take back repatriated pieces, right? And in Guatemala, there are no museums that take back repatriated pieces. There is La Ruta Maya Foundation, which actually, it's a museum per se, but it's more of I guess it's a foundation that has private funding, and they not purchase, but they take back pre-Columbian art, but most of it goes in storage, it's documented, and it's not really visible to see. But the thing that's really important about this is that the fact that these pieces have been removed from their archaeological sites, that's really half the learning right there. And so the fact that these pieces, we don't know where they actually were found, because remember, back in pre-Columbian times, people were trading art, it was moving all over the place. So you can't really say that this is actually from this place or that place, even though it looks like that. And so once that piece has been removed, you lose half of the knowledge. A Maya vase is a great example, okay? So yeah, once that vase has been taken out of the country, like we have a Maya vase, we can date it. Sometimes they have glyphs that tell us who made it, what it's about. But we can't, we don't know the full story, right? And so it loses a lot of its value. And so it's kind of like, why are you going to send it back? Because it's just a Maya vase at this point. The best example of this is this is kind of one of my favorite Maya vases. You guys know what the Maya vases are, right? They're used to drink cacao. They're cylinder vases, and they're made about 280 to about 980. That's kind of like the classic period of time. Okay, so the Buena Vista vase is one of the most important examples of this, and this is why the whole in situ and where it's found is important. The Buena Vista vase is a vase that was made in Guatemala in Naranjo. It's basically on the eastern side of Guatemala, northern. And this vase was made in Naranjo it was for a Naranjo king, and it wasn't found in Guatemala. It was found in Belize, in a place called Buena Vista de Cayo. It was actually in a tomb for a son of a king. And so again, this shows the importance that this piece, had it been on the art market, just out randomly, it would be, hey, it's a cool Guatemalan vase from Naranjo. But the fact that we found it in a Belize tomb, a royal Maya tomb, tells us a lot more about it, and that's the information that gets lost once it's, and again, it's unfortunate, right? A lot of information does get lost, but again, the cat's out of the bag. I mean, again, if there were laws back then to protect the pieces, this would be a whole different argument, but they weren't. So a lot of these pieces did leave the country, unfortunately. But it just goes back to the fact that now they're asking for these pieces back. It's like, there's really no reason to. I mean, it's just, most of the knowledge, or half the knowledge, is lost once it leaves the country. And you can't put the cat back in the bag, right? Okay, so anyway, okay, this is my personal opinion, right? So this is going to be very controversial. Okay, so very controversial. Okay, so what's really behind this patrimony campaign and returning the pieces? And again, this is my personal opinion, but I mean, it's just based on what I've seen before. I personally believe it's propaganda to appease the indigenous people of the countries that are involved, and the big one would be Mexico. So why would they do that? Why would they have this propaganda? Well, it's a great headline, right? Hey, we're going to return the patrimony to the indigenous people. We're going to get your stuff back, right? And it sounds great, right? You're like, hey, yeah, we're on board, But then when you really think about it, like why are they doing it? Well, it's because these governments and the countries have a long colonial and colonizer history, and so and that history goes back to discrimination. Oppression of the indigenous people, right? In some cases, for example, in Guatemala, there was actually a genocide where the government sent troops in to do bad things and unalive hundreds of thousands of Maya people and displaced millions, during the Civil War. And so, if you've ever traveled to these sites, you'll know that the indigenous people of the country don't live like the other people. It's like, and we know because we've traveled, right? For example, you don't have 24-hour electricity. You don't have Wi-Fi, internet in many places. The school systems aren't very good. Housing, jobs, opportunities. And why do you think there's and this ties into like what's going on right now, right? Why do you think so many migrants are coming to the United States? Because of these living conditions. And it's typically the indigenous people that live out in the outskirts, right? The people that live in the cities of these countries, they do pretty well, right? Very sophisticated skyscrapers, you name it. They have every modern convenience. But these indigenous people do not live like that. And so again, I believe that this propaganda is to appease those people and make it seem like, because, remember, this repatriating campaign is a lot easier than actually fixing all these problems I talked about, right? Because those are really complicated problems that you can't just fix overnight. But a really fancy campaign to get your stuff back, right? And I would argue that, remember, who found and sold these pieces originally into the art market? The same indigenous people, right? So it's kind of like, it's the irony is just incredible, right? When you really think about it. So I would say that would these people be happier with improving their daily lives versus getting old clay and old stone back? I would say yeah. And again, you have to remember that the government created conditions that allow these pieces to be sold into the art market. Number one, by not protecting them, and number two, by not giving the indigenous people the opportunities they needed to succeed. And then when you don't have jobs, right? What are you going to do? I mean, hey, oh yeah, remember when we were kids? We played over at that Maya ruin up there. Like, there's stuff we can find. We can dig it out and find it. And then and then another ironic aspect of this is that, remember I mentioned the Tikal project down in Guatemala, 1959 to 1969, where basically the entire city of Tikal was excavated, restored, the whole thing. Well, there are hundreds of indigenous workers that that did the back-breaking work. They cleared the trees, they chopped everything down, they restored everything, right? Well, when that project stopped after 1969, guess what? All those hundreds of people weren't employed. And so, and then that, on top of that, that was the civil war that was going on in Guatemala, where the oppression was taking place against the indigenous people, right? So what are you going to do for work? Well, you just taught several hundred people how to dig, where to find this stuff, and where it's located. And so guess what they did? And that's when it just took off. And so, and then of course, 1972 is when the UNESCO treaty really took place in Mexico. So everything focused on Guatemala, and that's when the pieces started going out of the country. And then finally in 1985, that's when Guatemala joined the UNESCO treaty, and so put those protections in place, and then kind of stopped that. So, but anyway, it's just really interesting because it's all kind of like full circle, right? It just kind of comes around. Okay, so basically the gist of it is that we're trying to have pieces, well, they're trying to return pieces essentially by force, right? You know, they're trying to get these pieces back that were purchased legally, you know, private property, and then returns to people that sold it to the art market. So again, it just doesn't make sense, okay? These pieces came out when it was legal to do so, for their protections in place, and then, you know, now they want them back. So I always have people, make it make sense, right? I mean, again, this is just an honest conversation, right? Again, it's my opinion, but let's have this conversation and really talk about it, right? So, again, I'd argue that the indigenous people of these areas would benefit more by just, you know, better jobs, better education, housing, you know, just the basic things that we take for granted every day: electricity, running water. We're in Tikal in Guatemala. They cut off electricity at 12 midnight, and then it comes back on at 6. That's the jungle for you, right? And that's where these indigenous people live. Can you imagine, right? Like waking up and it's dark, and then that's your daily life because there's no electricity. You know? So, anyway. The other thing that people say too is that well, that belongs in a museum, right? That you should send it back to Mexico. It belongs in a museum. I don't know if I talked about this last week, but only 3% of a museum's collection is actually on display because they don't have the space. Even out here, I mean, you should look at the cabinets underneath, right? Just packed with stuff. So maybe I shouldn't have said that, but anyway, that's kind of where we're at, right? They don't have there's a storeroom, everything. There's not enough space, okay, and again, it just goes back to, so why do you want to send more artifacts and more pre-Columbian art back to these countries when they don't have the space to display what they have? Best example of this is okay, Diego Rivera. He was an epic collector, collected 60,000 pieces of pre-Columbian art in Mexico during his lifetime. When he passed away, he actually designed a museum to house his pieces called the Anahuac Museum. It's located in Mexico City. 60,000 pieces, okay? Can anybody guess how many pieces are on display? A little bit more. You're getting there, okay. 2,000 pieces are on display, okay? And like 2,000 out of 60. So that means 58,000 pieces are in storage. There's actually a warehouse attached to the museum to house these pieces. They're just in boxes, never to be seen again. So again, the conversation goes back to how in the world do you want every American, every museum, right? Because they want it all back, to be sent back to these countries, and then you have 58,000 of Diego Rivera. He's that national treasure, right? And his collection, his personal collection, it's all in storage. I mean, again, make it make sense, right? It doesn't make sense to me. To me, it's like, well, if you really want these pieces back, you would house and display those pieces. So anyway, so I think that's kind of an interesting conversation that no one really has. And you know, and I will mention that China went through the same thing during the Cultural Revolution, right? When communists took over, they sold a lot of their patrimony, a lot of their cultural art onto the art market just to get rid of it, and sometimes just gave it away because they didn't want that. Remember, communism, right? That's what they're about. And now what the difference is that they're actually buying the pieces back. They're not trying to get people to send it back, but they're actually buying it. The government is buying the pieces. So I would say, like, maybe the governments of these countries, if they're so serious about getting these pieces back, that they would actually buy it. So and then, you know, I just want to say, like, you know, that people say, like, oh, that's stolen. Well, nothing was stolen, you guys. Remember, there were no laws in place that protected these pieces. They were legally sold onto the art market. And for those that say, well, that was stolen, well, okay, is Diego Rivera a thief, right? Because technically, like, he owned these pieces in private, in his private home, right? Was Frida Kahlo a thief? Was Rufino Tamayo, the great Zapotec artist from Oaxaca? He had it. In fact, his pieces are in a museum. Well, 3% of them are in the museum. Miguel Covarrubias, right? And again, these are famous household names. They're Mexican painters that had huge personal collections because, again, there were no protection. You could go into they had art markets on weekends where the indigenous people would come and bring their pieces to sell that they would find. It was open. Dealers from the United States would come down. Like, it was a free-for-all. And again, because there were no protections in place, okay? So, Anyway, so I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so how do I feel about things now? Well, personally, I think there's a lot of balance in the art market, right? I think things are good the way they are. The UNESCO treaty is in place, right? And there are people that argue that the UNESCO treaty is actually null and void. Reason being is that it was the UNESCO Treaty of '72 was designed to stop trafficking of artifacts, to stop the sale of cultural patrimony. And guess what? They succeeded. I mean, what you see now is very little. There's very, like, in fact, you don't even hear about things going on. And that's important, right? Because it works. It did its job, right? So how can the UNESCO treaty be valid if it's, it accomplished what it was supposed to do? But anyway, there's really no widespread looting. All the sites are protected. If you go travel down to any of the sites, there's guards, there's rangers. I mean, it's protected. It's all funded, right? And also, there are laws in place now. So, for example, Mexico's passed laws personally in their country, in addition to the UNESCO treaty, that protect the pieces and added the claim to the cultural patrimony. Here's something that no one's going to tell you about, okay? And this is really an interesting thing, okay? Mexico, again, they're trying to get the pieces back, repatriate them, right? All that. So I find it interesting that there are sites on Facebook right now, and these are based out of Mexico, where people sell these cultural artifacts. And they've been doing it for years. And I know, because I've joined these sites, and I don't buy anything. It's obviously against the law, but it's just interesting the fact that it happens. And the reason why I joined these sites is because I want to see, is this really happening? And it is. So out in the open, on Facebook, Mexicans are selling artifacts to other Mexicans and even to the United States and other countries. And I know because they've actually reached out, hey, do you want to buy this? Do you want to buy that? I'm like, no, it's against the law. Well, I sell it all the time to Americans. And so that's pretty scary when you think about it, right? So why isn't the government doing anything about that? Why aren't they could shut it down tomorrow, right? But again, it's not that headline, right? They want the headline. Hey, we're repatriating the pieces back. They kind of want to brush that off to the side. And again, it just makes that whole argument disingenuous, I guess. That's probably the right word. So anyway, but I think right now there's a lot of cooperation going on between the private collectors, governments, museums, institutions, academics, and researchers, and it's all working very well. One of the thing that was really interesting is that, for example, there are a couple of Maya vases that are like really incredible Maya vases that are in the private collection. And when I first saw them, it's listed anonymous donor, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. I wonder if I can find out using my contacts who actually donated these pieces, because these are like incredible pieces. And so I talked to a couple friends, and I found out I'm not going to say who owned those pieces. One of them is the vase of the 11 gods. If you want to go home and Google it, it's an incredible vase. It's actually a square, rectangular vase. And my friend told me who actually donated to the museum. And he also said this. He's like, my friend told me this. Like, I don't roll like this, but he's like, I actually offered that guy $1 million for that vase, and he said no. And and the reason being is that this person donated to LACMA, to the LA County Museum of Art. So now it's in their private personal collection there, and it's out there for the world to see. It's online. You can look at pictures of it, and they're sharing. And actually shot an exhibit a couple months ago, and it's wonderful, right? But again, it just shows the cooperation between the private collectors, between the institutions, and then again, there's a lot of sharing going on. So, for example, whenever you have books that talk about Maya art, Pre-Columbian art, West Mexican, a lot of the pieces that you'll see in these books are actually in private collections. And again, it's just because everyone's working together. So it just really tells you about the harmony, the balance that's in the marketplace right now. And so anyway, I think it's really cool. Okay, the last thing, I know it's been a little bit longer, right? So the last thing I want to talk about currently, there is legislation going on currently, and this is, first time in 40 years that there is legislation that's going to affect the antiquities market. In fact, it's going to affect the entire art market, and it's called the Art Market Integrity Act. It's a bipartisan bill that's going through the Senate right now, the U.S. Senate, and it's sponsored by Fetterman Grassley, so it's bipartisan. And the purpose is to stop money laundering and cartel funding through art, because they're saying that a lot of stuff, a lot of art is being sold onto the art market, and it's funding these organizations, right? So basically what it does, it parallels a law that was recently passed in the EU, where it stops the import of pieces, or if it does come in, it needs to be approved by a government body, and then it has to have documentation that says prior to 1972. So the problem that I have with it, and other dealers and collectors, is that it's really redundant and doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. I mean, there are already laws against money laundering, right? They have they call it the suspicious activity report, right? If you deposit $10,000, it flags, the IRS. So I mean, what's the purpose of this, right? And it's kind of the same thing, right? I mean, why is the government focusing on something so random like this when we have inflation, housing crisis? I mean, you name it, right? There's a lot of problems going on there. Again, I love this country, but why aren't they fixing those instead of something like this? again, make it make sense, right? But anyway, so that's going on right now, and it's just basically all it's going to do. And I read through the entire law last night. I just wanted to make sure before I'm going to talk about it, right? And again, it just basically adds more paperwork, more redundancy to everything that's going on. There are already laws in place that cover all of this, but it's just going to be more red tape. It's not going to affect the art market to the collector, the end user, but it does create more paperwork, more bureaucracy, which is great, right? We need more bureaucracy in the government, right? That's wonderful. But anyway, so I think, I think it's just kind of a waste of effort, and the government would be better served doing other things, and the people would be better served. But anyway, that is what's going on right now. And again, it's interesting because in the last 40 years, that's the first thing that's come up in 40 years that's going to talk about the art market, and not just the the antiquities art market, but the art market in general. However, antiquities is a part of it. So anyway, so hey, in closing, I just want to say that there's a lot of complexity to the laws and the legalities, right? As I talked about, right, and a lot of vagueness. But the way things are, we use 1972 as the date. That's the date we want to use for Mexico. And again, remember 1985, whatever the date that was ratified by the country, the UNESCO, that's the date that we go by as far as the legalities for collecting pre-Columbian art. So my personal opinion is that there's actually enough art to go around for everybody. I mean, pre-Columbian art is rare, right? I mean, it's an antiquity, but there are hundreds of thousands of pieces, right? And we talked about how the museums in Mexico can display what they have now. Like, there is enough to go around with everything for everybody, right? It's a sharing of knowledge, right? And so if we go by what Mexico, Guatemala, all these countries, they want to send everything back, right? Well, what good does that do? Because I think having pre-Columbian art, like in museums like here, right, Heritage of the Americas Museum, and elsewhere like LACMA Art Institute, it's a good thing. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, right? Because we're sharing that. And so when you think about it, there's how do you say, I want to say this like the proper way, right? But there's a lot of things going on with Hispanic culture right now that aren't that great, right? It depends on how you look at things, right? There's a lot of things happening, and the fact that you have this wonderful art that shows that the cultures were so sophisticated, so beautiful, so wonderful, right? Remember the narrative of the conquistadors, the Spanish, was that these were savages, right? That these people deserve to be, we could take whatever we want from them. We could instill Christianity on them, right? Because they don't know better, and then we're going to make them better by making them Christians, right? And so to try and dehumanize them, right? Well, this artifacts prove otherwise. It proves that these were very sophisticated cultures. These were incredible cultures, right? And we're still trying to understand, a lot of things about them because they were so sophisticated and so incredible. They built incredible structures that are still standing today after thousands of years, right? I mean, a road 6 months later, it's got potholes and it's falling apart, right? There are Maya roads that were built 2,000 years ago that are still visible from the air and from space. It's insane. Okay, but again, it just shows that these cultures were so sophisticated, so amazing, and the art is what helps people see that, and so it helps people understand. I mean, just look. I'm just going to generalize here, right? I mean, I'm Hispanic. I know Mandy is, right? But majority of people aren't. But that's cool because you guys are here. You're interested. You're learning about it, right? And so that's how we share ideas and we get that out to get the information out to other people, right? We understand different cultures and we work together, right? We unite. Now, by sending all the art back, it's gonna to me, I think it's gonna kind of hamper that, right? For example, a zoo is a great example, right? Well, some people say, well, yes, it's bad for the animals, they're in cages basically. Yeah, but what does it do for the understanding of the animals to help preserve some animals are close to being extinct, and it's a good thing to get that information out. Hey, we want to protect these species and these animals, right? I think that's the same thing with pre-Columbian art, and you see museums and institutions. It makes you want to learn more about the cultures. It makes you appreciate the cultures, and it makes you want to protect, and help enforce the protections, right, that are already in place. So anyway, so I think the benefits are basically preservation, education, and it outweighs everything else. So I think that's kind of where we're at. So like I said, there's a lot of complexities to the art market right now. I hope I addressed some of them and you guys found that interesting. But there's a lot of vagueness too, and you can see how the dialogue sometimes gets a lot of shouting on both ends. I mean, remember, there are people that disagree with eating meat. I'm sorry, I like a good steak, right? But it's the same thing with pre-Columbian art. There are people that are adamantly against collecting, and there are people that are for it. I'm one of them, and I know a lot of people that are. But I think what we have right now is such a great fine balance that everything's working together, all these institutions, collectors, dealers, academics, and I think we're just in a great state now. So it's like, why would you want to just mess with that? So, but anyway, that's just my personal opinion, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the talk, and then I appreciate every single one of you guys for coming. Some of you guys came back again for round 2, so thank you guys, and I appreciate every single one of you. So thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thank you to all you guys. And thank you to the young people in the audience. I thought for sure you guys were going to tap out after about 15 minutes of talking about the laws. So I know some of it was kind of like, okay, but it's important to understand, right? You have to understand the framework to be able to get to the deeper conversations. And so, I was like, so thank you guys. Hey, that's the use. Yeah, Applause to our youth, guys. That's our next generation, so thank you, guys. Yeah, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take on any questions you may have. Maybe I just answered everything so 100%.
So in Mexico,
Yeah.
they have their land. They can find an item on there. It's theirs.
Yeah.
But they can't sell it outside the country.
But they still do. That's the problem, and that's what I remember on these Facebook groups. People, in fact, sometimes they even show people actively digging. Remember I talked about last week that a lot of the artifacts, especially in the West Mexican region, were found on private property, right? People would dig the land and they'd find them. Back then, though, they would sell them before 1972, but people are still finding artifacts, not to the extent they were back in the day, because a lot of it's been either put in museums or sold. But people are still doing it today. And so again, just like property rights that we have in the United States, right? Whatever you find on your land is yours to keep. You have the land rights, you have the mineral rights, and you have the air rights to your land. And the same thing in Mexico, and that's how they allow them to keep it. So officially, they're supposed to register the pieces with INA, and then it's technically it's the government or the state that owns these pieces, right? But what's going on is that the people, for all intents and purposes, are keeping those pieces and it stays in the families, because the government doesn't really have an apparatus to go in and, hey, we're going to follow up on that piece from 20 years ago to make sure it's still there, right? So it just doesn't happen. So. But yeah, it's really interesting, right? And again, it's kind of like when you're talking about the patrimony campaign, like how do you expect someone, like for example, I'll take me for example. I bought a piece from an auction here in the United States, right? It's West Mexican, from Mexico. I paid money for it. It was imported legally when it was legal to do so. And so don't I have a property? I don't have a right to that property, right? It's my personal property. I paid for it, right? It was legal to do so. It's legal here in the United States. So how can a foreign government come in and say, nope, sorry, we want it back? Again, make it make sense. And then obviously with the conditions that are still going on in Mexico right now, with people keeping pieces they have on their land, it's again, it adds to the complexities. It's not just a yes or no kind of thing, but yeah, it's really interesting.
So. Okay, in pre-Columbian, okay, yeah. Well now you can put an exact date on that for the entire America. So a pre-Columbian at where Columbus landed would be a different than pre-Columbian in Guatemala, say.
Yeah.
So there's some leeway there that I would think would be tough to find.
Yeah, and then I think that's, you remember, all pre-Columbian art is basically just ancient art from Mesoamerica that came in before Columbus, right? Basically at 1500s and stuff. But you have to remember too that different countries, they strengthened their laws after this, right? And the UNESCO Treaty actually defines what these are, because a lot of the laws that are put in place were very vague, and so that's what the UNESCO Treaty, it defines that cultural patrimony, and that's why it's so important. It gives absolute claim to these countries to say this is ours now, and so that's why we use that date, the 1972 date for Mexico, 1985 for Guatemala, and whatever country. Remember, every country, Peru, every country that has patrimony. I mean, even for example, Egypt, Italy, Greece, they all joined the UNESCO Treaty too for their patrimony, because that was being sold as well into the art market. Because same thing, they didn't have absolute claims to their cultural artifacts. So.
So you talked about problems with determining who the owner of the artifact is. Is there any way to actually determine that, or?
That is an awesome question, young man. Okay, but a young man in the back asked, in case you guys didn't hear, he asked, is there any way to determine who was the actual owner of the artifact? And that's the problem. It's actually impossible, right? Because remember, these artifacts are thousands of years old, right? So how do you go back in time? Again, there were no records back then. You're talking about people that live in villages in some cases, some of the Maya temples and cities. Like, how do you figure out who actually owned it? And then remember, like we talked about too, people were actually trading, they were gifting. I remember the Buena Vista vase, right? It was gifted. So like, how do we go back and determine actually who owned these pieces and where they came from? It's really impossible. It's like, once you let that cat out of the bag, it's hard to put that back in. And that's why the whole thing where we're at now, we're talking about the balance, the unity, everything's working in the art market. And remember, these countries that are trying to get these pieces back, they don't have enough room right now to display what they have. I've seen some things where government officials say we have the apparatus to handle these pieces. Well, yeah, but they don't say they're going to display them, because I think a lot of people believe that, okay, well, we're going to send this piece back to Mexico, and then next time I go to the National Museum of Anthropology, it's going to be there on display. I get to see it, right? No, far from the truth. It's going to be cataloged and it'll be put into storage and everything. And that's even if it makes it into Mexico. Remember, there is still, I mean, I love Mexico. I mean, don't get me wrong, but there is still a lot of corruption that exists. And for those that say, well, that's not true. Well, Claudia Sheinbaum, the current president, ran on an anti-corruption platform, so it tells you it's still, it's still going on in Mexico. So there are people that believe that, well, there's really no laws in place to handle this repatriation. That some of it may get filtered off and sold onto the art market, like back again, ironically, right? So again, it doesn't really solve the problem. Do you have a question, young man?
You said 3% were on display.
Yeah.
Is that like? Sorry.
Yeah, don't be sorry.
I have another question. You said like it might not make it to Mexico in the first place. Why is that?
Okay, so and again, I'm just generalizing and everything, but there is still widespread corruption that happens, but through officials, and these pieces are valuable, so there's value to them. So there are instances where pieces can get sold back onto the art market and not make it where they're supposed to go. Remember, these pieces are not going to be that get repatriated, or they want to get repatriated, aren't going to be on display anywhere. So there's really no apparatus to keep track of these pieces. So for example, a piece gets sent back to Mexico, it's not going to be put into a museum, it goes into storage. Well, how do we know it goes into storage, right? And then who's running these storage facilities? Here's a great example. My fiance and I, we went to Tikal last May. We were actually in a museum. I'm not gonna tell you. There's two museums. I'm not gonna say which one. We were in a museum in Tikal, looking around, and one of the gentlemen that worked in the museum spoke Spanish, and he was noticing that I was talking a lot about the pieces and talking to my friends about what they were. And he asked me like, "Hey, do you collect this stuff? Like, what's going on?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm a collector in the United States." He's like, "Well, I actually have some pieces I can sell you." And I was like, whoa, this is crazy, right? I mean, this is not really happening. And then I thought, maybe it's a sting. That's one thing. And then I thought, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to see how far I can take this. I would never in a million years do that. It's against the law. It's immoral, illegal, the whole thing. Not worth. You can buy stuff cheaper here in the United States anyway. But I was like, how far can I take this, right? And he actually came back with in his pocket. He brought a handful of jade artifacts, some little masks, and he gave me prices. And I said, okay, cool. I'll be back. And let me get some money from the hotel, and I'll be back. And we booked it out. But it tells you, again, there is corruption in these places. And again, I'm not saying that every place is like that, but it just does happen. So, and to talk about the 3%, I think this is what you were asking about. So a museum does not have that much display space. They have more storage space than display because of so many artifacts, right? And so that's where I'm talking about the 3% gets displayed. The rest of it is on storage, it gets put into storage, gets documented, right? So we have access to it, but it's not on display. So, like my thinking is like, well, if you're going to repatriate pieces to put into museums, right? Because what else can you do with them? Like, well, why don't you display what you have already? Because you don't. I mean, Mexico would have to build probably 100 more museums to display what they actually have. And same with all these countries, right? Because there's so much, so many pieces of pre-Columbian art and artifacts, right? But they don't. But okay, Mandy in the back.
So when they are selling these illegal items, like the guy that was like, "Oh, I got all this stuff," is it real?
Oh yeah, it was real. There were a couple little fake little trinkets in there, but yeah, it was real. That's why it was so shocking to me. It was like, wow. Now, just to be fair, they weren't pulling things out of the display cases or anything, but this is stuff that they had access to. But it's still like it's still insane.
Still the same stone, but made today, and they're trying to.
No. There are a couple modern pieces, but the majority were actually antiquities. They're ancient pre-Columbian art pieces, like some jade pieces, little masks. So it's pretty wild when you think about it. So
They were also small. They were.
yeah, they were small. I mean, it was a handful, like that kind of
You
thing.
could just snag it, put it in your pocket when you're walking, like
Yeah.
just finding it randomly.
Oh, well, I'm sure he probably, people buy, trade, they find things in the sites and stuff like that, and they kind of give it back and forth. But yeah, it was really interesting. Like I said, I was shocked, but anyway, that's where we're at. So,
Wait, so UNESCO World Sites, why were they created? For like looting?
Okay, well, the 1972 law that the UNESCO treaty was created to stop the looting, but 1978, the World Heritage Sites, that's when they actually started branding them as a World Heritage Site. And I think a lot of it was just to bring more attention to the sites, encourage tourism, and then that tourism money gets put back into the sites to protect them. They can hire rangers, and it's just for, again, protections and acknowledgement, but and it makes them important, right? So it's recognizing that cultural heritage and the cultural sites.
Wait, even with these UNESCO World Sites, does looting still happen to them?
I'm not going to say absolutely not because I'm sure there's some isolated cases. But when I visited any site, like there's rangers there. They close the park at night, and they keep really good track of who's going in there, so that they know, and they actually do patrols in most of these sites. So for the most part, I would say the majority of looting has stopped. Now, what I think is going on, like I think some people find on their own personal land, they find artifacts, right? Because remember, modern people live on top of some of these ancient sites, right? That because it's so vast, right? And I think those are the pieces that are ending up on the art market now illegally, right? But again, the whole thing goes back to like, why aren't the countries enforcing the laws they have in place to stop this? Because they could if they wanted to.
So I went to Pompeii over the summer, and in Pompeii, they were showing evidence of like looters being there.
Mhm.
So, but I don't understand why are these artifacts so valuable?
They're valuable because they're art. So and people have people have been collecting, since the beginning of time, right? So even during ancient times, people collected art of their ancestors, and so it's just kind of a human nature, right? And so I think people still continue to do so. And then a lot of people that live close to these sites, remember we talked about people that are indigenous. There's a lot of poverty going on. That they know that there's money to be made there, and that they can sell a piece and it could help feed a family for a month, 2 months in some cases, or even longer. So yeah, there is value there, but I think a lot of it goes back to the government taking care of the people in the first place, so they don't have to do that, and then give them opportunities for jobs. Also educating them on the importance of these pieces, right, and explaining to them, hey, this is why we don't do this nowadays. And again, just recognizing that, okay, pieces have already left, they're gone, we're not going to get them back, but let's work to preserve what we have now, because there's still a lot of pieces that are still buried underground, in all these countries around the world, and so let's focus on those, I think.
Do you think there's like a more efficient way to stop looting?
Man, you guys are having some. This is the youth. In case you missed it, he said, "Do you think there's a better way or official way, right, to stop looting?" I think a lot of it really goes back to education for the people that are close to these sites, right? Letting them know the importance of these sites, and then also opportunities, right? Giving them opportunities where they don't need to loot, where they have jobs and they can support their family. I think that's the only way you're going to stop it, because obviously laws don't work, right, 100%, because there are laws in place, and yet it still happens, again, in isolated cases, right? But the education, I think that's the next step, because there are laws in place, right, to stop, but they have to enforce them 100%, and also the education part of it will kind of fill the gap and make it like bulletproof.
You're always going to have degrees.
You're always going to have one. I mean, you can never do anything 100%. But again, like I mentioned before, everything is pretty good right now. So all that widespread looting that was happening before, it's gone. But there are some isolated cases. We'll do one more question.
So you also said that some artifacts are buried under houses. Is there like a way to find those artifacts other than like digging up the house somewhere underground?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because how would you get underneath it? Here's a great example. So in some of these homes that are in Mexico, right? Again, use Mexico as an example, where what will happen is the house is built, right? Again, this house might be a couple hundred years old. Maybe it was even older than that, built in colonial times. And then say they have a water break, right? And so they have to dig underneath the concrete, and then get to access to a pipe. And then guess what? They find like a huge artifact or a stone piece or whatever. So a lot of times that's how that happens. But the majority of those artifacts that are found on private property are actually being found in farm fields, right? Because the farmers are plowing their fields and they see something or they hit something, and then just the ranchers clearing the land for the cattle to graze. That's another reason sometimes they'll find things that are sticking out of the dirt. Heavy rains come sometimes in these areas, and so that'll kind of clear some of the dirt out, and then they'll see something sticking out, and they'll find something. But then again, you have a lot of cases where people actually are digging in their areas because they know, hey, I know there's artifacts underneath there because of where the location is. And according to the government, it's legal to own because it's on your private property. So anyways, just want to say thank you guys. I appreciate that. If you guys have any more questions, we can talk about it one-on-one, but I appreciate you, and thanks for being here. Cheers. And thank you at home for watching. I appreciate you guys. Leave any comments you have, any questions you have in the comments, and I will address them. So cheers, you guys, and happy collecting.